Okay, I'm going to start off with a question, and unlike all the other questions, I already know the answer. Who here has ever started a new job? Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's great. This talk should be for you. So when you start a new job, it doesn't matter how great you did in your interview. It doesn't matter who you know who already works in the company, and it doesn't matter if you're a world leader in your field. You're still going to arrive and have just too many questions, and you're going to be utterly clueless. And it's even worse because you're usually the only one who's new, and you're just looking around thinking everybody else seems to know what they're doing. What do I do? But that's a good thing. One of our senior staff said to me when I joined that hiring new people is one of the great opportunities of a new workplace. And that horrible feeling of being lost is something that you can turn into your greatest strength, because everybody else doesn't just know what's going on. They've been in the job for 3, 4, 5 years, and they've had enough time to get up the basic knowledge so that they look like they know what they're doing. They have the same questions as you. And if you start when you arrive, you start documenting, you can really turn things around for future hires and even for yourself. So first, a little about me. I started off in anthropology, and that's Betty White in what I could imagine is the most famous depiction of anthropology, holding a bow in an episode of Community. Real-life anthropology is a lot less bow hunting and a lot more talking to people about their lives. Then I got into technical work, and pretty much all the jobs that I've had have involved technical things. So I've got a lot of experience of being the person in the room who knows the least. I'm currently doing support work, which means that I have to know a little bit about a lot of things, and that's something that documentation really comes in useful for. I've worked at a few jobs. Most places, documentation has been pretty sparse. I worked in one place where all the documentation was stored as uploads in a Facebook group. That's not great. Other places, they might have not much documentation apart from comments in code. And companies that do have strong documentation, they often see an over-reliance of assumed knowledge, which can make it really hard for somebody who's just starting and maybe even make them feel a little stupid. But there is my personal favorite, one company that I worked for. They stored their documentation. It was perfectly good documentation, but it was stored in a subfolder of a subfolder on a shared server, and it was labeled only with the date that it was created. So no, it was perfectly good, but nobody ever looked at it until I was asked to update it because it hadn't been updated in 5, 6 years. So I'll be talking about why you and your company should invest time in your first few weeks, what you should choose to document when you start, how you should document, and the next steps, how to future-proof your work so that others will continue after you've gone. So why should you invest this time? Because you know the right questions to ask when you first arrive. Everything's new. You don't have any preconceived knowledge. Something that seems easy and natural to somebody who's been doing that job for 2 years is going to seem alien and impossible to you as somebody who's just starting out. So in some companies, there's limited or no documentation. Things might have been explained in a way that assumes a lot of pre-existing knowledge. But you can change this for somebody in the future. Nobody's going to remember all the lessons they taught immediately, including you. So anything that you do document when you start is going to serve as a reminder for you. I've done that a lot. I review things that I've written because I can't remember at first. But I think one of the most important things is that strong internal documentation fosters a personality diverse and inclusive team. And it's really a non-confrontational way for everybody to access knowledge. So there's team members who might be introverted, or they might suffer from social anxiety, and that makes it really difficult or perhaps impossible for them to access the knowledge they need to do their jobs if it's only stored inside the heads of people who've been there for several years. And that can get even worse if the staff has a problem with clickiness, or there are staff who simply don't want to answer questions. A lot of people say the phrase, there are no stupid questions, but that might not really turn out well. But documentation doesn't have that. There genuinely are no stupid questions. It's never going to judge you. So what should you document? Anything you find hard. And that's really anything. If you find something difficult to remember, then there's a chance that there's a hole in the documentation that you can fill when you learn it. So, for instance, I do technical support, and when I'm writing, I'm going to write for somebody who's going to follow me into my job. And anyone who's going to do technical support is going to need a broad and kind of a bit of a scattergun approach. They're going to need to be able to diagnose issues, and they're going to be fairly technically competent, but possibly not quite as technically competent as a developer. So you need to think about this when you do write your documentation. Who are you going to be writing for? So for me, with this picture, I can do a lot, but if it's anything that's highly technical, for instance, Git, which I have had to document instructions on, or if the role requires a bit of coding, this needs to be spelled out step by step. But you also need to keep in mind, if you're writing any documentation for anything that's going to be accessed by someone outside your immediate job description. And this might include things like how to book leave in the company system. This needs to be accessed by every employee, and it doesn't matter if they're technically competent or not, they need to know how to do it. So if you consider documenting how to book leave as log in and to the portal and make a leave request, that's possibly not enough, because you need to write it so that everybody can understand it, even if they don't use a computer at all. So if you're just starting out, what do you do? Ideally, your company will already have a quick and easy way to create and edit internal documentation, like a wiki or a SharePoint. We have a wiki that anyone can edit. And if you have access to this, you can use it. Whenever you have the time, write out steps on how to do your job. And it's pretty rare to join a company that doesn't already have this, some sort of system. It's possible you might join a company that you might not have access to this in the beginning because you're too junior or it belongs to somebody else. But that doesn't mean that you can't document. You can write out Word documents on your own computer and upload them later when you have more seniority and you have editing privileges. I work in support, so I actually use a lot of saved support tickets, and I find that pretty fantastic. If you have access to support tickets, I'd recommend having a look at them, because you might discover things like how customers use your product that you might not have thought of, or little pain points within your product. I like to write private notes if I want something explained in a support document, and then somebody will answer. And then I can save that ticket and I can document it later. I've done that quite a bit. It's quite good. One of the other things I use is notes to yourself on Slack. That's obviously not perfect, but in this scenario, we are new. We're just starting and you're trying to take things in while everybody's shouting at you all these different instructions. So it is quite good for, more difficult things. We use a lot of command line tools. For instance, for searching logs, we do email. So a common question is, I didn't get my email. What happened to it? We need to use logs for that. In the past, I've had somebody help me crafting a log search, and I haven't had time to document it and understand it properly. So I've written the log search out in a note to myself on Slack, and then later I have more time. I'll run the search again and figure out how it works, and then document it properly. So the best thing about internal documentation, in my opinion, is that it is internal. And that means you can churn it out quickly and you can worry about the spelling later. And you can also have a bit of fun. It can be a great place to welcome people to the company because it's not customer facing. You don't have to agonize over every little choice of words. So I write a lot of tutorials, and I like to use metaphors and characters to explain more difficult concepts. It makes it more enjoyable and easier for me to write, and hopefully it makes it better for somebody else to read. I know it makes it better for me to read. I once wrote a tutorial on how to solve one of these log searching problems with what happened to my email from the perspective of Iron Man complaining that Captain America wasn't emailing him when he was emailing all his friends, all his other friends. So I found that quite funny myself, and I can do that. It really helps get concepts fresh in my mind. I also like to make interactive things. For instance, interactive tutorials. Again, log searching, we do it a lot. I ask people to send themselves an email and then go through how they can track that email themselves. So I find that interactive components really helps me. I've retaken a lot of my own tutorials quite a bit. Hopefully other people will get some use out of it too. But if nobody else does, at least I have it. So there's also a lot of assumed knowledge with non-technical things. Company social life, for instance, I think it's really important that everybody should have access to social things. And so you need to document any regular social events, how to access the social calendar, who can suggest ideas of things to do. That's just how to be a bit more inclusive and not only worry about the technical side of your job. So after you've started and you've gotten it all out of the way after your first 6 months, what do you do next? So most of what I've talked about is around your first few months. And I think documenting in your early days is essential and it's fantastic work, but it doesn't end there. After you've reached the 6-month mark, you've found your feet, you know generally what's going on. So what do you do next? Your documentation, when you upload it, needs to be accessible, and not just for reading, but also for editing. So you need to be storing internal documentation somewhere everyone will be able to access, regardless of their technical expertise, and most people should be able to edit. This might require a bit of input on the part of your employer, but it's really important. Companies often believe that employers are a bit of a captive market. You have to do your job, so learn how to use the system. I don't think that's good enough. For instance, the legal team, it's really important that they are able to document policy changes, but you can't expect all the legal team to have great technical training or technical knowledge. So the place for documentation needs to be accessible for them to edit it without too much pain. It also needs to be searchable, and that's really important. That's something we could improve on. But preventing knowledge loss is what documentation is all about. And part of that is making sure people can access things after everyone's moved on and people have forgotten where it is. You shouldn't rely on saying, hey, Bob, where did this help page go about my problem? You need to be able to ask a search engine that question. And what about new changes? Because now you've been in the job for a few months, you got your feet, and there are changes that start to roll through your company. You need to think of 2 types of people who need to be made aware of these changes. That's your future replacement, who I've been talking about most of this time, and also the people who are currently in the job. So this means you need to update your documentation in 2 places. I think a great way to start documenting new changes is to email people. But that's a terrible way to end documentation. It's only going to help people who are in the company now. People who start in 6 months, if they come across outdated documentation, but everybody knows that it's changed because they received an email several months ago, it's not going to be very helpful. So we do use emails at Fastmail to document changes to the relevant group. And that's pretty fantastic, really. But the opposite end is if you update the documentation and don't tell the people who you are currently working with about any changes, because they're not going to go through your help pages all the time. They've got other things to do. So you need to document as well as email. So an idea to encourage continuous documentation is have a company policy that if you email the update, you have to write the documentation. No excuses. Another idea would be to have a rotation of people who take turns in doing it. So one person takes a week and they receive the emails, they document all new changes coming up. So I like to edit the documentation and then send the email. And when I do that, particularly for tutorials, I like to ask feedback from two groups of my tutorial or update. I ask people who've been there shorter period than me, who have less experience, and I ask people who've been there longer and have more experience for feedback. And the people who have less experience than me are able to tell me if I've assumed knowledge, if something isn't clear, if I've made it clear only to myself. That's really important. And of course, the people who have more experience than me in whatever the situation is, they can tell me where I've made mistakes and make it more accurate. So this asking people for feedback, particularly newer people, is a fantastic way to start getting new people involved in the process and make them feel like they're valued. So quality internal documentation should be accessible with a really low technical literacy bar to access the documentation. It should be able to be accessed by somebody who only uses a computer for things like web browsing and email. It needs to be editable by somebody with a lower technical skill. I would argue that it should be editable by anybody, including people who are new, but it at least needs to be editable by somebody who doesn't know much about computers. It needs to be searchable, because that is the way employees find really obscure knowledge. And it needs to be peer-reviewed. Somebody who's been there 2 weeks can find mistakes that somebody with 5 years experience can't, because they know the right questions to ask. And at the same time, the flip side is true, somebody with 5 years experience will be able to fact check, because the only thing worse than dispensing no information is dispensing wrong information. So, I've talked about how the new person in the company is the best equipped to deal with internal documentation, and I believe that's true for any company and any job. So even if your job does not involve documentation, I would encourage you to start doing it at any new job you have, and encourage new hires to get really involved in the process and dive right on in. And it will cut down on your training time significantly. It helps eliminate the dissemination of fragmented knowledge. I think it's one of the best ways to start off at a new company. So